everyone, I'm Alice. Welcome back to another GRE video. Today we're going to be going over an example of the analyze and argument essay, breaking down the prompt a little bit, and then looking at an essay that one of my students has sent to me for review. We'll go over all of the different details that he's written in the actual essay and discuss a little bit about different ways that it could be improved and what it's missing in order to get that score of a 6. So if you're interested in becoming my student yourself, more information on that down below and at the end of the video. So what we're looking at today is an argument. It says the following appeared in the health section of the Greenhorne Gazette. Now, that part is not super important, but we can assume, because it's called the health section of something called a gazette, that this is probably in a local newspaper or something like that. So looking at the actual argument itself, Motilac, not sure about the pronunciation there, is a substance that occurs naturally in the human digestive tract. Many consumers of dietary supplements containing Motilac report significant easing of digestive discomfort after just a few weeks of use. Among Greenhorne residents, the consumption of Motilac supplements has increased 80% over the last 7 years. Last year, Greenhorne's 5 hospitals reported fewer cases of serious gastrointestinal disorders than any year on record. Meanwhile, sales of Motilac supplements are declining in the neighboring town of Etolin. Notably, hospitals in Etolin report a steady increase in the last 2 years in patients experiencing a wide range of distressing gastrointestinal symptoms. The clear explanation of these trends is that Motilac is effective in preventing many serious gastrointestinal disorders. The question: write a response in which you discuss one or more alternative explanations that could rival the proposed explanation and explain how your explanations can possibly account for the facts presented in the argument. So essentially here we're trying to not necessarily disprove what's being said here, but question all of the conclusions that this paragraph has made. A few things to note as we go through all of this are the following. So the first sentence is really a fact, so there's not really too much that we can question there. The second sentence, many consumers of dietary supplements containing Motilac report significant easing of digestive discomfort after just a few weeks of use. Something to note here is that we don't really know how much that is. Just because it contains something doesn't mean that we have a good idea of how much that is. It could be 1% of the dietary supplement. It could be 100% of the dietary supplement. There's no information about exactly the amount there. There's also the issue of the reporting. So number one is, who are these consumers that are reporting these? Who is gathering this information? And there's also a consideration called correlation, not causation, meaning that just because these two events are happening at the same time doesn't mean that one causes the other. Now, in this case, it seems a bit implausible, but it could definitely be that easing of digestive discomfort makes people want to eat more Motilac. That's definitely a possibility, although logically, it doesn't always make the most sense, but it could be true there. The other thing that we want to think about is here it says, among Greenhorne residents, the consumption of Motilac supplements has increased 80% over the last 7 years. But the next sentence talks only about the last year. Now, this is really important because we have really different time frames. Just because we have a change of 80% over the last 7 years doesn't mean that that change was constant the whole time. That change could have been 8 years ago, nobody had any Motilac. And then the next year, which would have been 7 years ago, there was this huge boom, a sudden increase, and that has just, stayed steady all the way until now. So there wouldn't have been a difference between last year and the year before. So just because it says that there's an increase doesn't mean that first, that timing is even relevant here. The other thing is, just because Greenhorne's 5 hospitals reported fewer cases of gastrointestinal disorders doesn't mean that that's exactly what's happening or that it's an accurate reflection of the truth. It could be, for example, that there was better reporting system, a better testing system or diagnosis. Doctors may have been a lot more aware that gastrointestinal disorders should be tested for, or anything like that. You can also think that perhaps healthcare was more affordable or it was more accessible. Maybe there were more hospitals or something like that. There also could have been an increase in Greenhorne's population that led to an increase in the number of disorders simply because there were a lot more people. These are all possible explanations that could account for the change that we see, and it doesn't just have to be because Motilac is decreasing the number of gastrointestinal disorders that we see. The other thing to note here is that we have a comparison of Greenhorne and Etolin. Anytime that you see a comparison in the argument essay, that is always a red flag. You always want to question the validity of that comparison. In this case, we have information about Greenhorne and Etolin in terms of Etolin having a lot more gastrointestinal disorders. But perhaps it's that healthcare in Greenhorne is just extremely expensive, or people don't like the doctors or whatever reason, and if they're experiencing gastrointestinal disorders, they're choosing to go to Etolin instead. That would increase the numbers in Etolin and decrease those in Greenhorne, even though the total number of gastrointestinal disorders are the same. The other thing here to note is that we have the clearest stated argument at the very end of the paragraph. So the last sentence says, the clear explanation of these trends is that Motilac is effective in preventing many serious gastrointestinal disorders. So that is something that you definitely want to highlight and keep in mind, because that's the argument that you're trying to question and you're trying to get more information for. A few other alternative explanations that I thought of going through this were that perhaps there was a difference in water or environmental quality that led to gastrointestinal disorders. Perhaps cases were less serious. You can also think about changing of the case definition. What that means is that instead of actually changing the types of diseases that people are getting, you actually just change the definition of the disease that we're looking at. So previously, if you had 50% pain, maybe that was considered serious. But now it's considered serious if you have 25% pain or higher. So all of those extra cases are now counted as serious disorders, even though previously they were not. So that's something to think about as well. We don't really know anything about the consumption of Motilac in Etolin either. So here, if you notice, the sentence specifically says sales of Motilac supplements. But there are different ways now to get supplements. People can order them online, and that's not going to show up as sales in this town. But they might be getting the same amount of Motilac as well. There is also something else to think about in terms of where people are getting Motilac. Here, they're kind of assuming that Motilac only comes from supplements or that normal food and drink doesn't really contain any, when in fact that could be totally the opposite, and your daily diet affects those levels really significantly. So as you read through this paragraph and try to start breaking it down, you want to start examining all of the different arguments that they're making, identify the big main overarching argument they're trying to say, and point out all of the different details that are pointed to, and just question every single one. Remember, the argument essay is really about questioning the argument, and it's really not about saying definitively that any conclusions that are drawn here are incorrect. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So, that being said, let's look at what this student wrote. The author of this argument states that the higher consumption of Motilac leads to a decrease in serious gastrointestinal disorders. The author bases his or her conclusion on a study, or more an observation, he or she did in Greenhorne and the neighboring town Etolin. The author observes that an increased consumption of Motilac decreases the heavy gastrointestinal cases, and a decreased consumption leads to more such cases. Although the author's argument might hold true, there needs to be discussed other explanations before we can verify his or her conclusion. Overall, this is a pretty good introduction paragraph. There are a few grammatical mistakes, which makes sense because this person is not a native English speaker. But a few things that this person does really well is, number one, summarize in one sentence the argument that's being made in the paragraph. I have that here highlighted in yellow. The author of this argument states that, and then the argument is right there. So that makes sure that the person grading understands that you understand the argument being made. The other thing that this person does is the green sentence, and that is state that even though the author's argument might be true, we just don't have enough evidence to say if it's true or not. So that's definitely something that you want to add in there. And again, it's really about uncertainty. It's not that this author is totally wrong. We just don't know. Potentially, it could be right. We just need more evidence. And that's the stance that you want to take on that. One other thing that I did want to point out here is right here. So a study or an observation. Observations in social science are considered valid types of scientific study. So you don't really have to make this distinction, and it's really not an important distinction to make. Moving on, first, the argument is based on observations. In order to believe the author's conclusion, we need scientific significant studies that show the exact increase in Motilac within food, and therefore that the observed correlation of less serious gastrointestinal illness can also be proven statistically. Here, this is something that you might not be super aware of if you're not a scientist, but there's nothing inherently wrong with an observational study. Just because you have an observational study doesn't mean that your conclusions are invalid. All that it means is that there are certain types of limitations to observations. So just by saying that observations are not scientific enough, that's not a strong argument. Here, the other thing to note is that there's not really such thing as proof statistically. What you're really looking for is enough data that supports a conclusion. This is a little bit of scientific thinking and scientific jargon, but instead of really focusing on significance in scientific studies, you really want to focus on the idea that the relationship between Motilac and gastrointestinal illness is not clear. So yes, you can mention scientific studies and more information, but you don't want to focus too much on scientific proof or, discounting other types of studies, because each type of study does have a place in science. I don't particularly like that paragraph because of it, but as long as that is tweaked just a little bit to focus again more on the need for more scientific study and more information to really solidify the relationship of Motilac and gastrointestinal illness, if that can be identified, that really bridges the gap that this writer is trying to talk about. Next paragraph. Otherwise, there might be another reason for a decline in gastrointestinal disorders independent of the rising consumption of Motilac. The food, or also the dietary supplements that contain a lot of Motilac, can also include another substance that is the reason for the decline. Another explanation could be that the citizens of Greenhorne simply eat healthier. Therefore, we need a scientific study that might show that this correlation with less serious gastrointestinal disorders is because of the Motilac. This would strengthen the author's conclusion. So here, I think, as with some of the other paragraphs, what this test taker does well is state very clearly what this paragraph is going to be about. The first sentence is explaining that there could be other reasons for the decline that we see. That is definitely something that you should be doing as well in your body paragraphs, is make clear what you're going to be exploring in each paragraph. The other thing here is that this sentence where he is explaining about the overall consumption of Motilac is slightly different from the fact that the citizens of Greenhorne are simply eating healthier. I think the only thing that really needs to be highlighted here is this idea about correlation. So even though it is good to point out that this is a correlation that's being studied, we do not want to conflate that with causation. Meaning that just because two things are happening at the same time doesn't mean that one causes another, and that's something I just mentioned above. This is something you will see over and over and over in argument essay prompts. So anytime you see it, you want to highlight that this argument is talking about correlation, and we need a lot more information to be able to establish causation, that Motilac is the cause of fewer gastrointestinal disorders. For the next paragraph, it says, second, there might also be an external effect that changes the amount of serious gastrointestinal cases, which has nothing to do with nutrition and therefore nothing with the consumption of Motilac. For example, there could have been a change in the water quality within these two cities. Maybe Greenhorne increased its water quality because they have new policies concerning water pollution of firms. On the other hand, Etolin weakened its regulation and therefore has a lower water quality, which leads to more gastrointestinal disorders. Therefore, we need more evidence to justify that the change in the serious hospital cases is based on the consumption of Motilac. As I mentioned before, water quality is definitely something that you can mention. The whole idea is that there are other policies that are affecting gastrointestinal disorders and not just Motilac. The only thing I believe here is that this argument is so similar to this previous paragraph, it would be better to just combine them. The reason is that you're talking both about other reasons for the decline of gastrointestinal disorders. You're not really exploring a totally different idea, and because of that, combining everything into one paragraph is a lot better. So you would say something like, focusing on the external effects here, and you could mention water quality, you can mention dietary supplements or other foods, and you can also mention simply eating healthier. So those are all things that could fit together in a single paragraph. You don't ever want to explore one idea in multiple paragraphs or multiple ideas in one paragraph. So anytime you have anything like that happen, combine or separate paragraphs as needed. The last paragraph here I think is pretty solid as well. The conclusion says, in essence, the author's conclusion might be true, but we need a lot more studies to verify his or her explanation. We need more information about Motilac, about the amount it is contained in food and consumed, and about its effect on human digestion. Therefore, we need evidence that the decrease of hospital cases is based in nutrition and not because of an external factor like the water quality. So again, this conclusion is well written because we have here that the author's conclusion might be true. We just need more information. And then he has a sentence or two talking about what information it is that we need, and then just one sentence to really close out all of the essay, highlighting what it is that we want to do. We want to figure out that the decrease in hospital cases is due to nutrition, due to Motilac, and not any other type of case. Overall, that's well written. One idea that I had as well is here about testing Motilac versus human digestion. Perhaps it could be compared to a placebo, which means that you basically give somebody a sugar pill or something equivalent to that so that people think that they're taking the supplement, but they're not actually taking it. And it's been shown in scientific studies that just by people thinking that they're doing something good, taking a sugar pill, but something that doesn't actually have nutrients, can actually improve health. So that's definitely something to consider. Overall, I think this essay is relatively well written. I would probably score it around a 4, possibly a 5, but it has a few extra typos and it doesn't really explore that many ideas. So I would say it's probably around a 4. In order for it to get that higher score, I think number 1, there could be a little bit better reasoning. So these 2 paragraphs both deal with the idea that there could be other reasons for gastrointestinal disorders, but ideas for examining the actual disease themselves, like better reporting, more affordability of healthcare, people going to Etolin instead of staying in Greenhorne, those are ideas that weren't really mentioned at all. So this first paragraph is relatively weak because it doesn't really explain why scientific studies are needed rather than observations. And these 2 paragraphs are essentially talking about the same thing, that other food or another or eating healthier or better water quality is accounting for these differences. Because of that sort of limited exploration of different explanations, I think that limits the potential of this essay a little bit. Overall, I think it's relatively well written, and this author does explain why certain things are important. There could be a little bit more explanation about why scientific studies are so important and why we have to question the information that we're given if it's not a scientific study. But overall, it is well written, and what you need to make sure you are aware of are all of these different potential explanations for what is said here. In the end, a few key takeaways that I want you to know is that number 1, you want to make sure that you incorporate the prompt. So this specific prompt was talking about alternative explanations or other reasons that could account for the facts that we see, and you really want to tailor your essay towards that. So really thinking about different reasons that we would see what we see. The other thing is to know that there's no real such thing as proof. So other than in the legal sense, in science, you can't 100% be certain that something is for sure happening. What you really are doing is gathering a lot of information that leads to the same conclusion. So you're really saying it leads to this conclusion, or it points to this conclusion, or it strongly implies that this is happening, but you're not exactly proving 100% that something is true. The other thing to note is that there were a few typos here, and that I think hurt the essay a little bit. It wasn't too bad, but probably less than one per paragraph would be the best. If you look on the ETS website, all of the essays that score 5s and 6s really just have a handful of typos, if they have any at all. Thanks for being here. If you're still here, I want to go over a little bit about my private GRE tutoring if you're interested. So how it works is I meet with you to come up with a customized plan. You can choose between writing, verbal, or quantitative, depending totally on what you think you need. I provide sample questions, study resources, and content review depending on your needs, and we talk about different strategies for test taking as well. I offer really flexible payment and scheduling options, and as you can see, one of my former students said that he hadn't written any type of essays for over 5 years, but I patiently worked with him and got him back up to speed. I was very personable, and the tutoring sessions were very productive and professional. If you're interested, please contact me with the information down below. Thank you so much, and hope to see you again next time.